In 1996, two college students waiting in the Columbia River in Washington state stumbled on a human skull. The bone was old, very old, but the face didn't look like anything archaeologists expected to find in North America. The forensic anthropologist who examined it said the skull had features that looked European, not Native American. Within weeks, the claim went national. Newspapers called him the ancient European who crossed the Atlantic 9,000 years ago. They called him Kennewick Man, and for almost 20 years his face launched a war over who was really first in America. But DNA just proved that face was wrong. In 2015, a team at the University of Copenhagen extracted DNA from a tiny fragment of hand bone. The genome they recovered was the oldest complete sequence ever pulled from a skeleton found in the Americas. And it didn't point to Europe. It pointed to a population the scientific establishment had spent 2 decades trying to keep him away from. Kennewick Man was Native American, genetically closest to the Colville tribes of the Pacific Northwest, the very people who demanded his return. 9,300 years in the ground, and the bones had been speaking the truth the whole time. The question isn't just who Kennewick Man was, it is how an entire scientific establishment got him so wrong. The story begins on July 28, 1996, on the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington. Will Thomas and Dave Deasy were watching hydroplane races when they spotted a round object in the shallows. It was a human skull. Police called in James Chatters, a local forensic anthropologist. Over the following weeks, he recovered nearly an entire skeleton. The skeleton was remarkably complete, 350 bones and fragments. Male between 40 and 55 years old at death. Chatters measured the skull, the narrow face, the projecting nose bridge, the long cranial vault. None of it matched the morphological profile used to classify Native American remains. He described the features as Caucasoid, not European, necessarily, but closer to European morphology than to any modern Native American population. A facial reconstruction followed, and the face that emerged looked nothing like the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest. It looked, according to media reports at the time, like Patrick Stewart. The claim made headlines worldwide. Radiocarbon dating placed the skeleton at roughly 8,500 years before present, calibrated to around 9,300 years ago. If the skull looked European and dated to the end of the last ice age, could Europeans have reached America thousands of years before anyone thought? This idea already had a name, the Solutrean hypothesis. It proposed that Ice Age Europeans paddled along the Atlantic ice shelf to reach eastern North America. The hypothesis was fringe, rejected by most archaeologists. But Kennewick Man's skull gave it fuel. 5 Native American tribes, led by the Umatilla, claimed Kennewick Man as an ancestor and demanded repatriation under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. 8 scientists led by Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian sued for the right to study the bones. The legal battle lasted 9 years. In 2004, the courts sided with the scientists. The skeleton was not culturally affiliated with any modern tribe, the ruling said. And then came the DNA. In 2015, Eske Willerslev's team at the University of Copenhagen obtained enough genetic material from a hand bone to sequence the full genome. The results were unambiguous. Kennewick Man belonged to haplogroup X2A, a mitochondrial lineage found in Native American populations. His nuclear genome placed him closest to modern Native Americans, and specifically closest to members of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Not European, not Polynesian, not Ainu. The man who'd been called Caucasoid for 2 decades was genetically indigenous. So how did the skull fool everyone? The answer cuts to the heart of one of the most dangerous assumptions in biological anthropology. Cranial morphology, the shape of the skull, has been used to classify race since the 1800s. Samuel Morton's skull collection. The cephalic index. The assumption was simple. Skull shape predicts ancestry. Narrow nose and long vault equals European. Broad cheekbones and rounded vault equals Native American. But genetics has proven this wrong. Skull shape is influenced by diet, climate, random drift, and developmental plasticity, not just ancestry. The Jomon people of ancient Japan had skull features that look European by Morton's standards. They weren't European. They were Northeast Asian. The same features evolved independently in populations separated by 10,000 miles and 10,000 years. Convergent morphology, not shared ancestry. And here's what makes it worse. Early Americans in general looked different from modern Native Americans, not because they were European, because 9,000 years of evolution changed the population. The first people to enter the Americas came from Northeast Asia during the last Ice Age, crossing Beringia when sea levels were 300 feet lower. They carried a set of genetic variants and skull morphologies that no longer exist in modern populations, not because they disappeared, because they evolved. Kennewick man's skull didn't prove he was European, it proved he was ancient. The face was from a time before modern Native American features had fully developed. Researchers at the University of Michigan showed that cranial morphology in the Americas shifted dramatically between 9,000 and 5,000 years ago, likely driven by changes in diet from hunting to agriculture. But here is the twist. Proving Kennewick man was Native American didn't end the controversy. It deepened it, because a haplogroup doesn't tell you which tribe someone belonged to 9,000 years ago. Tribal identities, as we know them, didn't exist yet. The Colville affinity is statistical, not cultural. Kennewick man is closest to the Colville, but he is also related to every Native American population on the continent. The DNA proved he wasn't European. It didn't prove he was Colville in any meaningful cultural sense. He predates those cultural divisions by thousands of years, and the legal framework that governed his fate, NAGPRA, was written for remains that could be culturally affiliated with living tribes. It wasn't designed for 9,000-year-old skeletons. Some anthropologists argued the repatriation set a dangerous precedent. If any ancient skeleton found in a region is automatically returned to modern inhabitants, what happens to the science? Others argued the opposite, that the scientific community had exploited indigenous remains for 2 centuries, and this was long overdue justice. In 2017, Congress passed a law specifically authorizing Kennewick man's repatriation. The skeleton was returned to a coalition of 5 tribes and reburied in a private ceremony. The bones are gone now. No researcher will ever study them again. So what was learned before they disappeared? Kennewick man wasn't alone. In a dry cave in western Nevada, another ancient American skeleton had been sitting in a museum since 1940. The Spirit Cave mummy was wrapped in woven tool mats and dated to over 10,600 years ago, making it one of the oldest human remains in the Western Hemisphere. And just like Kennewick man, the skull was classified as Caucasoid, the same narrow face, the same projecting nasal bridge, the same wrong conclusion. In 2018, Willerslav's team sequenced Spirit Cave 2. The result was identical in its implications. Native American, not European, not Caucasoid. The genetic signature placed Spirit Cave squarely within the founding population of the Americas. 1,500 miles northeast in the rock shelters of central Montana, another skeleton had already rewritten the timeline. The Anzac child, discovered in 1968 near Wilsall, Montana, buried with over 100 Clovis stone tools, the largest Clovis cache ever found with human remains. The child was roughly 12,600 years old, the oldest burial ever found in the Americas, and in 2014 his genome was sequenced. Rasmussen's team found the Anzac genome was ancestral to all modern Native American populations south of the Arctic, every single one. 3 ancient skeletons, 3 Caucasoid skull assessments, 3 DNA tests proving Native American ancestry. The pattern was undeniable, but the deepest insight came from comparing all 3 genomes to a population that nobody knew existed until 2018. Ancient Beringians, a ghost population identified from an infant skeleton found at the Upward Sunday River site in central Alaska, dated to 11,500 years ago. The infant, known as Sunrise Girl Child, carried DNA that represented a population lineage that split from the ancestors of all other Native Americans more than 20,000 years ago. This meant the founding of the Americas wasn't a single wave. It was at least 2 distinct branches from one source population in Beringia. Kennewick man, Anzac, and Spirit Cave all sat on the southern branch, the branch that gave rise to every indigenous population from Alaska to Patagonia. The DNA didn't just disprove the Solutrean hypothesis. It mapped the actual founding of a hemisphere, and the Solutrean idea didn't just fail on genetics. Isotope analysis of Kennewick man's bones showed he ate a diet of marine fish, consistent with Pacific Northwest river systems, not Atlantic crossings. His strontium isotope ratios matched the volcanic geology of the Columbia Basin. He grew up where he was found. He wasn't a traveler from across the ocean. He was a local fisherman who lived and died along the same river where he was discovered 9 millennia later. His bones told another story, too. A stone projectile point was found embedded in his pelvis. He'd survived a violent encounter. The wound had healed over. He carried that stone inside him for years, maybe decades. This wasn't a man passing through. This was someone who lived a full, brutal, rooted life on this continent. So what does Kennewick Man actually tell us, now that the politics have settled and the bones are back in the earth? First, that skull shape is not a reliable proxy for genetic ancestry. This was assumed for 2 centuries. Kennewick Man helped bury that assumption. Ancient Americans were morphologically diverse in ways we're only beginning to understand. Different skulls, same founding population, same continent. Second, that DNA is a more powerful tool than bone measurement. But it has limits too. A genome can tell you which population someone is closest to. It cannot tell you their language, their beliefs, or their name. The Colville claimed Kennewick Man as an ancestor. The DNA supports that claim genetically. But 9,300 years of cultural discontinuity means we cannot know what he called himself. Identity is a story told by the living about the dead. DNA is just one sentence in that story. Third, and this is what most people miss, the real scandal isn't that Kennewick Man was claimed by the wrong group. It is that science spent 20 years asking the wrong question. Was he European? Was never the right question. The right question was always, what did the first Americans actually look like, and why did they look different from their descendants? The answer, morphological plasticity over 9 millennia, driven by diet, climate adaptation, and genetic drift, is far more interesting than any conspiracy about European explorers. And it opens a question that genetics is only now beginning to answer. There are dozens of ancient skeletons across the Americas that were classified using the same flawed morphological framework. Luzia in Brazil, Peon Woman in Mexico, the Bull Woman in Idaho. How many of them were also mislabeled? How many more stories are waiting inside the bones? Ancient DNA technology is advancing faster than the political will to apply it. Thousands of remains sit in museum collections. Each one carries a genome. Each one carries a story. The question is whether science and indigenous communities can build a framework for studying those remains together, not against each other. Kennewick Man spent 9,300 years in the earth, then 21 years in a courtroom. Now he is back in the ground, and no one will say exactly where. His face was reconstructed to look like a European. His DNA said otherwise, and the debate over who owns the ancient dead, science or descendants, remains unresolved. If you want to see how DNA is rewriting more of what we thought we knew about the ancient world, subscribe. The evidence keeps coming, and the stories are only getting stranger. What else has been sitting in museum drawers for decades, waiting for someone to read the code locked inside the bones?